Hey everybody, welcome back. I'm Rachel Stewart and this is the Anti-Racism Summer Film Series. In this video, I want to talk briefly about two really important concepts for this series that we're doing, and that's prejudice and racism. So let's get to it. So what is prejudice? Prejudice is the irrational dislike, suspicion, or hatred of a particular group, race, religion, or sexual orientation. So the really important thing to understand about prejudice is that prejudice is irrational. The dislike, suspicion, or hatred that people feel toward that person or that group is not based in reality. It's oftentimes based in misinformation, disinformation, and our old friend from last week, stereotyping. Prejudice is really important to understand, though, because it is the foundation, it is the underpinning of all of the phobias and isms that are used to oppress and marginalize minority populations throughout the world, and specifically here in the United States. The most relevant sort of term for this, or the most relevant sort of ism coming from this, from prejudice for this course essentially, or this group, is racism. Racism is prejudice with the exercise of power on or over the group through institutional, historical, and social structures. So what's really important to understand about this definition is that racism is prejudice with the exercise of power. Okay? So this also goes into explaining why something like reverse racism does not and cannot exist. In order for racism to actually be racism, it needs to be prejudice, so the irrational hatred, suspicion, or fear of a group, with the exercise of power. Meaning that you not only can hate a group or a person from that group, but there is also practices in place that will continue to oppress that person based upon that hatred. This, as I said, is the basis for all of the isms and phobias. So, for example, homophobia is the irrational hatred, fear against gay and lesbians. You have transphobia, which is irrational fear, hatred, or suspicion of people who identify as transgender. You have Islamophobia, which is going to be the irrational fear, hatred, or suspicion of people who practice Islam. And of course, things like ableism, which is the prejudice or the irrational suspicion, hatred, or fear of people who are differently abled, or otherwise known as disabled. Oftentimes when we think of racism, though, we think of it on the surface level. We think of it in the aspect of interpersonal or individual racism. And that's going to be those face-to-face or covert actions toward a person that intentionally express prejudice, hate, or bias based upon race. So we think of the bigot, we think of the Ku Klux Klan member, we think of the white supremacist, we think of the person who is casually using racial slurs. So oftentimes when we think of racism and we think of ourselves positioned within this conversation, we will say, oh, I'm not racist, because oftentimes what we're thinking of is we're thinking of this individual racism. But racism goes much deeper than that. As a matter of fact, it is woven into the foundation of this country. This country was quite literally and figuratively built on the backs of slaves. And because of that, we have to look deeper at how racism permeates every part of our society. So what we need to explore as well is the concepts of institutional racism, structural racism, and systemic racism. So institutional racism are the processes and practices within and across institutions that, intentionally or not, produce outcomes that chronically favor or put a racial group at a disadvantage. One of the ways that we can see this is by having schools be funded by property taxes. I'm going to talk about redlining in a video coming up this next week. But essentially, if we have disadvantaged communities that don't have as much property tax, their schools are not going to be funded as much. So they're not going to literally be giving the same sort of quality education as somebody who maybe is just a couple of blocks over, but in a completely different zoning. So getting different kinds of taxes, property taxes going to the school. So this is something that you may not be personally practicing, but it could be something that you, if you identify as white or grew up in a more affluent neighborhood, is something that you benefited from while it disadvantaged somebody else. In addition to institutional racism, we have to take a look at structural and systemic racism. And so these two are very similar to one another, but there are kind of a nuanced difference. Structural racism is a system in which public policies, institutional practices, cultural representations, and other norms work in various, often reinforcing ways to perpetuate racial group inequity. So when we look at structural racism, these are going to be the historical, cultural, and social, psychological aspects of our current society. So how is it that our society is structured to help some while disadvantaging others? Systemic racism is similar, but it more focuses on policies and how the system of government and society work. So let's talk about a really sort of prominent case that takes a look at this structural and systemic racism and touches on sort of its counterpart, which is white privilege. I'll be breaking apart white privilege next week for this. So most of us have probably heard of Brock Turner. For those of you who don't know who Brock Turner is, or don't remember, or have blocked it out, Brock Turner was a young man who was found in the act of raping a very obviously drugged and unconscious woman. So Brock Turner became famous because of how this case was treated. Brock Turner was a Stanford swimmer who was found raping a woman behind a dumpster, and he was actually pulled off of her by 2 eyewitnesses and held there until the police could get him. What was of note of Brock Turner's case was that while he was found in the act of raping an incapacitated woman, he was only sentenced to 6 months of jail, of which he served 3. And the reason for it was the judge saying, and I quote, that he didn't feel like he should do something to ruin this young man's life. Obviously, this was highly problematic, and from a feminist point of view as well. And this was sort of this outrage because in addition to him getting this insanely small sentence, it was also very much focused on him as a victim. He got expelled from Stanford, and they would publish his swim times when talking about the case, and sort of this whole thing of Brock Turner just being in the wrong place at the wrong time. So the case of Brock Turner made national news because it showed this disparity in the system. Another case that many of you probably have never heard of is the case of Brandon Banks. Brandon Banks was a football player at Vanderbilt. Now, him being a football player at Vanderbilt matters no more or no less than Brock Turner being a swimmer at Stanford. Brandon Banks was also charged with and had evidence of raping an incapacitated woman. Brandon Banks was sentenced to 15 to 25 years in prison. So nearly identical cases, nearly identical situations. What was the difference? The difference is Brandon Banks is Black and Brock Turner is white. The joke that's been going around lately that is not at all funny, but more sobering, is that most of us have now spent more time in quarantine than Brock Turner spent in jail for raping a woman. What does this come into racism? This comes into racism because the justice system shows massive structural, systemic, and institutional racist practices. But it's not just our prison system. It's not just our justice system. It is in our communities. It is in our schools. It is in our workplaces. How many of you have been asked to change your haircut because it was against policy? Black people go through that every day with the inability to, with different structures that don't allow their hair for them to have natural hair. So the policies that don't permit afros, or policies that don't permit dreadlocks. That would be sort of the equivalent of people coming in and saying that the Karens can no longer get page boy haircuts. Systemic and structural racism affect everybody. It advantages some and disadvantages others. A big part of anti-racism is understanding that even if you yourself do not experience this, it does not mean it doesn't exist. In addition, it doesn't mean that you aren't also exhibiting unconsciously racist behavior. And this brings me to the last term that I want you to think about, and that's implicit bias. Oftentimes people will say, I'm not racist, but then they will still act in ways that could perpetuate racism or prejudice. So what is implicit bias? Implicit bias are individuals acting on the basis of prejudice and stereotypes without intending to do so. The thing is that all of us are exposed to these images and these practices of a power structure and hierarchy based upon race. And we can see ourselves in the images and in the ongoings of the world of where we are within that power structure. So if we continuously see images in media of that Black men are violent, so the stereotype that all Black men are violent, oftentimes, even if we don't consciously hold that bias, we will act in unconscious ways that will perpetuate that. There was a really interesting study that was done to prove this, which was they did research where they had an experiment where they had women walking down the street at night, and in the control group, they had a white man coming toward her, and they wanted to see essentially what women would do based upon the person coming toward them. So they would send him down the street, white man would walk past, and the most part, people, the women would just pass by that man. When they did it in the experimental group and they used a Black man coming down the street toward a white woman, the majority of women crossed the street to the other side and walked on the other side. When asked afterward in a debriefing why they crossed the street, they couldn't articulate why. They just said they had a feeling of unease, they didn't feel safe. When this was paired with an implicit association test, or an IAT, they found that all of these women who crossed the street had an automatic preference, so an unconscious preference for Caucasian Americans or white Americans over Black Americans. So one of the things that we have to do is start to break down, what are my biases? What are these things that I wind up doing? And starting to recognize sort of our own behaviors. In addition, recognizing how things like institutional racism, structural racism, systemic racism, and even individual racism, how that is going on around you in your own life, and what are some steps that you can take to start to have a conversation about that. So if it is, for example, if you work in the school system, start to look at sort of little microaggressions that happen toward people of color in the classroom, how it happens in the administration, how it happens in your own business. So this is a good place to start sort of thinking about these different sort of roots of racism, how they've been perpetuated historically, and how we ourselves are perpetuating them as well. Thank you all so much for listening. I look forward to chatting with you all again soon. Take care.